The story of one honey badger forced zoo staff to completely redesign enclosures, because for him, ordinary walls simply did not exist. The events began long before this became obvious. In the southern part of Africa, within a reserve where the dry ground cracks under the scorching sun and rare acacia trees provide only faint shade, there was a honey badger's burrow. It was dug into dense yet workable soil and extended deep underground, branching into several tunnels. Each exit was hidden among shrubs, allowing him to appear in different places unnoticed. In this burrow, a cub was born, later given the name Karu. The first weeks of his life were spent almost entirely underground. Narrow tunnels, the scent of dry earth, and faint sounds from the surface shaped his perception of the world. He moved carefully, listened to every rustle, and gradually memorized the locations of the exits. Over time, he began to show more activity. At first, these were short trips toward the burrow's entrance. He lingered at the boundary between light and shadow, not daring to fully leave his shelter. Then he would take a few steps outside and immediately return. These actions repeated again and again until the space around the burrow no longer felt unfamiliar. As he ventured farther out, the first signs of his unique behavior appeared. He didn't just move across the territory, he stopped at every object. Stones, roots, dry branches all caught his attention. He touched them with his paws, tried to move them, and sometimes attempted to dig beneath them. If something didn't give way, he would return to it later. Gradually, his actions became more persistent. He spent longer near obstacles and didn't leave until he had examined them from different angles. If a stone was too heavy, he tried to loosen the soil beneath it. If the ground was too hard, he searched for a softer spot. These attempts didn't always succeed, but each one added to his experience. The environment in this region required a constant search for food. Karu learned to find insects under stones, dig out small animals, and respond to the slightest signs of movement beneath the ground. He quickly understood that the surface almost never offered ready solutions. Nearly everything had to be obtained through effort. With each passing day, he moved farther from the burrow. His routes grew longer, and he returned later. He memorized landmarks, scents, and hiding spots. His movements were no longer random. He headed toward specific places that had previously caught his interest. Sometimes he returned to the same spot several times. There, he continued what he had started earlier. He deepened a dig, widened an opening, or tried again to move an object that had resisted him before. This behavior set him apart from many other animals that switch more quickly to new food sources. Gradually, the area around the burrow began to change. Patches of dug-up earth appeared, stones were overturned, branches broken. These traces showed not just a search for food, but a consistent interaction with the environment. Karu seemed to be testing the limits of his abilities. By the time he was spending most of his time outside the burrow, it became clear that his behavior went beyond the usual. He didn't avoid difficulties, he lingered where effort was required. He returned to challenges he couldn't solve right away and kept trying. It was during this period that the traits began to form that would later lead to events changing not only his life, but also the way people approached keeping such animals. The period when Karu completely stopped depending on the burrow marked a clear shift in his behavior. He no longer stayed within the nearby territory and began expanding his routes, moving farther and farther from familiar shelter. His movements were no longer just about finding food, but about constantly exploring the world around him. He moved slowly and with purpose. In every new area, he would stop and begin examining anything that seemed unusual. Stones were no longer just part of the landscape. He approached them, sniffed them, then tried to move them. If a stone gave way, he flipped it over and carefully inspected what was underneath. If it didn't, he didn't walk away right away. Instead, he started digging nearby, testing whether he could weaken its base. He paid special attention to areas with dense soil. Where other animals would avoid difficult ground, Karu stayed longer. He tried digging from different angles, returning to the same spot if his attempt failed. His actions became increasingly methodical. It was as if he was testing different approaches, remembering which ones worked. During this time, he began interacting with objects more often. Dry branches were no longer just something to break. He tried to use them. Sometimes he pushed them under stones, as if testing whether he could create leverage. In some cases, he picked up a stone, carried it a short distance, and dropped it. These actions looked like experiments rather than random behavior. Observations of wild honey badgers do record similar patterns. They are known for persistence and an ability to use their surroundings. However, in Karu's case, this appeared more frequently and in a wider range of situations. As his territory expanded, so did the number of traces he left behind. Disturbed soil, overturned stones, and broken shelters of small animals gradually formed a chain of changes in the environment. These signs became noticeable not only to other animals, but to people as well. It was during this time that Karu first approached the edge of a research zone. This was an area where people placed equipment for observation and sample storage. The scents here were different from the natural surroundings, sharper and more varied. This caught his attention. He didn't enter right away. At first, he appeared at a distance. He circled the area along its edge, stopping, sniffing, and listening. His movements became more cautious, but his curiosity did not fade. After some time, he made his first attempts to get closer. He chose moments when everything was quiet. He approached objects, examined them quickly, and then moved away. These actions repeated several times until the new territory became familiar to him. At this stage, his interaction with human-made objects was still limited. He touched them, sniffed them, sometimes tried to move them, but he didn't yet make active attempts to break anything. This was a phase of study. However, even these early encounters showed that he perceived artificial structures the same way as natural ones. He tested them for strength, searched for weak points, and remembered the results. To him, there was no difference between a stone and a box. Every object became a challenge. With each new visit to the research zone, his behavior grew more confident. He stayed longer near objects and began applying more force. The first attempts to open or move things he had previously only examined began to appear. This shift from observation to action became a turning point. It meant that Karu was not just adapting to his environment, he was beginning to actively change it to suit himself. From this moment, a chain of events began that would soon draw human attention and lead to the first serious attempts to limit his freedom. Gradually, Karu's behavior reached a new level. Simple exploration was no longer enough for him. He kept returning to objects that had previously caught his attention and continued working on them as if determined to finish what he had started. This applied not only to natural elements, but also to items left by people. At the edge of the research zone, there were containers, bags, and crates used for storing equipment and samples. At first, Karu limited himself to circling them, sniffing and touching them with his paws. However, his actions soon became more persistent. One of the first recorded cases involved a dense bag of supplies. He walked around it for a long time, then began pulling at the fabric with his teeth. The material didn't give in right away, but he didn't stop. He changed positions, pulled from different angles, braced himself with his paws, and pulled again. After some time, the fabric weakened, and he managed to make a small opening. That was enough. He widened the tear and reached the contents. After that, similar actions began to repeat. He was no longer just testing objects, he was deliberately searching for ways to open them. If one method didn't work, he switched to another. He might start by pulling, then try digging underneath, and then return to tearing again. His interaction with more solid objects became especially noticeable. Wooden crates that had previously remained untouched began to show damage. Karu dug under them, loosened them, and flipped them over. If a lid had a weak point, he focused his effort there. In some cases, he began using objects from the environment. Near one of the crates were stones of different sizes. Karu picked them up, carried them, and dropped them onto the lid or the sides. This didn't always lead to immediate results, but over time, the structure weakened. After that, he returned to tearing or prying it apart. These actions were not random. He repeated them in similar situations, indicating the formation of consistent behavior. It was as if he remembered which methods worked and applied them again. Signs of his activity began to accumulate. Torn bags, damaged crates, and overturned containers became a regular occurrence. At first, the research staff assumed these were isolated incidents, but it soon became clear that this was a systematic pattern. Surveillance cameras were installed. They were the first to capture Karu in the act. The recordings showed that he did not act chaotically. He approached an object, inspected it, and then began with the most vulnerable area. If the attempt failed, he changed his approach, but did not leave right away. One recording was especially revealing. It showed Karu first trying to open a container by working on the lid. When that failed, he began digging under one side. The container tilted slightly and he returned to the lid, which now gave way more easily. His actions looked like a sequence of deliberate steps, not a random set of movements. By this point, it was clear that his behavior went beyond the usual. He wasn't just searching for food, he was actively interacting with his surroundings, reshaping them to suit his needs. His visits to the research zone became regular. He arrived at different times but returned to the same objects. If something didn't open right away, he would come back later and continue trying. Staff began to notice not only damage, but also changes in the placement of objects. Some containers were found shifted, and stones had been moved from one place to another. This showed that Karu wasn't just breaking things, he was rearranging elements of the environment and using them in his actions. At this stage, the situation was not yet seen as a serious threat. However, the accumulation of these incidents gradually changed that perception. It became clear that this was not just any animal, but a honey badger systematically studying and using every available opportunity. These events would soon lead to the first attempts to restrict his access to the area, marking the beginning of the next stage in the ongoing standoff between Karu and people. By the time Karu's presence in the research zone became regular, the changes in the environment could no longer be ignored. The damage no longer looked random. It followed a certain logic. Objects were opened, overturned, and moved, almost always in places where his activity had already been recorded. At first, the staff tried to solve the problem with simple measures. Containers were sealed more tightly, bags were lifted higher off the ground, and some equipment was moved to more protected areas. However, these steps did not bring the expected results. Karu adapted quickly. He began paying attention to new details. If a container was raised, he didn't give up. He looked for a way to reach it. He carried stones, stacked them at the base, and tried to use them as support. Sometimes the structure collapsed under his weight, but that didn't stop him. He returned and tried again, changing the arrangement of objects. His behavior near hanging bags became especially noticeable. At first, he tried jumping, but quickly realized it wasn't enough. Then he began digging under the supports holding the structure. If the soil allowed it, he weakened the base, causing the support to tilt slightly. After that, the bag became easier to reach. In other situations, he acted differently. He moved objects to the base of a structure and tried to climb them. Stones, pieces of wood, and even overturned containers were stacked into makeshift steps. These attempts were not always successful, but the fact that he repeated them showed he was searching for ways to overcome vertical obstacles. At the same time, Karu began showing interest in more complex objects. Some containers had simple locking mechanisms. At first, he pulled at protruding parts, but soon he began targeting the fastenings more precisely. He touched them with his paws, moved them in different directions, as if testing which effort would produce a result. Camera observations showed that he could spend a long time at a single object. He didn't rush. His actions looked like a sequential study. He tried one movement, then another, returning to a previous one if he noticed a change. It was during this period that the staff began to realize they were dealing with an unusual case. A decision was made to install stronger structures and restrict access to the most vulnerable objects. Some equipment was moved into enclosed spaces, and the remaining containers were reinforced. However, these changes had the opposite effect. Karu began spending more time in the area where he had previously appeared only occasionally. It was as if he responded to the increased difficulty by becoming more active. Now he was not only searching for food, but also interacting with the structures themselves. He started returning more often to the same objects. If earlier he might abandon an attempt and leave, now he continued working even when the result wasn't immediate. He dug, pulled, pushed, and used surrounding objects. His actions became more varied. Particularly striking were the cases where he combined methods. First, he weakened the base, then tried to move the object, and then returned to the upper part of the structure. These sequential actions looked like a single, continuous process. The traces of his work became more and more visible. The ground around objects was dug up, stones were moved, and structures were partially broken down. In some places, shallow pits appeared which he reused, returning to them later. By this point, it was clear that simple measures were not enough. Karu was not only adapting to changes, he seemed to be using them for further exploration. Every added difficulty became a new challenge for him. That was when the decision was made to move to the next stage and set traps intended to limit his movement and prevent further damage. However, this step would lead to a completely different outcome than expected. The decision to set traps became a turning point. Until then, Karu had been interacting with objects without facing any consistent resistance. Now, structures appeared in his environment that were specifically designed to stop him. The first traps were relatively simple. They were mechanisms with bait inside, designed so that an animal would enter and trigger a locking element. Such setups were widely used in field research and were considered reliable for most species. However, within the first few days, it became clear that in Karu's case, this would not be enough. Camera footage showed him approaching a trap, but not rushing to interact with it directly. He circled around it, stopped, sniffed, and touched the surface with his paws. He didn't make sudden moves or try to reach the bait right away. Then he began acting differently. He moved around the trap and tried to dig under its base. The soil there was compact, and the first attempt didn't work. He stepped away but didn't leave. After some time, he returned and started digging in a different spot, checking for a weaker area. When digging didn't work, he switched strategies. He began pulling at protruding parts of the structure. The metal didn't give, but he didn't stop immediately. He changed position, pressed with his paws, and tried to loosen the trap. After that, he stepped away and picked up a stone. He carried it to the trap and dropped it onto the side. The impact didn't break anything, but he repeated the action several times. These attempts didn't look random, they looked like a search for a solution. Eventually, he found one. He dug under one corner of the trap, creating a small gap. Then he returned to the front and pulled at the part holding the bait. The structure shifted and he managed to get the food without going inside. This became the first clear sign that standard methods wouldn't work. The staff reinforced the traps. They deepened the base, added stronger elements, and secured the structure so it couldn't be moved. But Karu kept coming back. Now his behavior changed again. He no longer approached traps from the front. Instead, he started from the sides, checking the base and searching for weak points, clearly taking past experience into account. In one case, he didn't even try to break the trap. Instead, he began digging nearby, not directly underneath, but slightly to the side. Gradually, he created a hollow from which he could reach the bait from an angle. It took more time, but once again, he succeeded. With each new encounter, it became obvious that his actions were becoming more thoughtful. He didn't repeat the same mistake. If a method failed, he changed his approach. Some traps he began to ignore altogether. This happened after several unsuccessful attempts. It was as if he concluded that the effort wasn't worth the result and shifted his attention elsewhere. This behavior suggested an ability to evaluate situations, not just react to stimuli. Still, stopping him completely proved impossible. He continued to find ways to interact with the structures, even as they became more complex. The signs of his activity around the traps became more and more pronounced. Disturbed soil, shifted parts, and marks from stones showed that each trap had become a problem he was trying to solve. At this point, the perception of the situation changed completely. It was clear this was not just an animal searching for food, but a honey badger systematically studying every obstacle and finding ways around it. This led to the next decision. Traps were no longer seen simply as a control method. Their purpose shifted. Now they were meant not only to limit him, but to become part of an effort to capture him. From this moment, a new stage began, one that would lead to a direct standoff between Karu and people. After it became clear that standard traps were not effective, the approach changed. The goal was no longer just to limit Karu's access to resources, but to capture him. For this, more complex structures were designed, specifically adapted to his behavior. The new traps differed not only in strength, but also in how they were installed. They were set deeper into the ground, their bases reinforced, and any protruding elements that could be used for leverage were removed. The bait was positioned so that it could only be reached by fully entering the trap. Another key difference was placement. The traps were no longer set in open areas, but along the routes Karu used regularly. These paths were identified through tracks and camera recordings. He followed the same trails, returned to familiar points, and checked them repeatedly. The first capture attempt with the new design showed that Karu noticed the changes immediately. In the footage, he approaches a place where he had previously found food, but stops at a distance. He doesn't come closer right away. He circles the trap in a wide arc, sniffing, returning to the same spots several times, but never touching the structure. He spends much more time nearby than before, yet takes no active steps. This behavior is different from earlier patterns. Previously, he would quickly begin trying to open things. Now, he seems to be assessing the situation. Only after some time does he make his first attempt. He approaches from the side and begins digging. The soil is dense, and the attempt doesn't succeed. He moves to another spot and tries again. When digging fails, he tries working on the upper part of the structure. He pulls and pushes, but finds no weak points. Unlike earlier traps, this one doesn't give in. After several attempts, he steps away. He lingers nearby for a while, then leaves. This episode is seen as a failed attempt, but the next day he returns. Now his actions are different. He doesn't repeat previous attempts. He starts by circling, then immediately begins digging in a new location. It's as if he has ruled out earlier methods and is searching for alternatives. In one instance, he begins digging not right next to the trap, but slightly farther away, gradually working his way toward it. This takes more time, but allows him to approach the base from a different angle. Although he doesn't fully reach the bait, the change in strategy becomes an important observation. Despite this, the traps remain in place, and attempts continue. With each passing day, Karu interacts with them more cautiously, but he doesn't stop trying. At that point, a different method is introduced. A sedative is added to the bait. The idea is that even if he manages to reach the food, it will lead to the intended result. However, this also proves challenging. Karu already has experience with traps. He doesn't rush to take the bait. In several cases, he approaches, examines it, and leaves without touching it. This slows the process. Time is needed before he begins to trust the setup again. Then one day, his behavior changes. He comes closer, stays longer at the entrance, and begins working on the structure. After several attempts, he finally reaches the bait. What follows happens quickly. After some time, his movements begin to slow. He moves away from the trap but doesn't go far. His activity decreases and soon he stops moving. This is the moment the staff have been waiting for. Karu is captured. Even in this state, he continues reacting to his surroundings. His body remains tense, his movements still purposeful, until the effect of the substance fully takes over. This moment marks the end of a long phase of confrontation in the wild. But ahead lies a new stage, one that will be no less challenging. Karu is about to be moved into a completely different environment where the limits will be far stricter, but his drive to explore and interact will not disappear. After the capture, a stage began that was expected to be routine, but quickly turned into a separate challenge. Karu had to be transported over a long distance to a specialized center and then to a large city zoo. For this, a reinforced transport container was used, designed for strong predators. The container was a metal structure with double walls and secure fastenings. The base was solid without gaps, and the door was locked with multiple mechanisms. Everything was designed to prevent any attempts to break out from the inside. During the first hours inside the container, Karu was still under the effect of sedatives. His movements were slow, but even in this state, he didn't remain still. He shifted position, pressed against the walls, and touched them with his paws, as if testing the limits of the space. As the effect began to wear off, his behavior changed. He became more active. First, he walked along the walls, sniffing the surface. Then he began scratching the metal, testing its response. The sound didn't change anything, but he continued. After that, he tried biting at protruding parts, but quickly switched to other actions. He paid special attention to the corners of the container. He returned to them several times, pushed with his body, braced with his paws, and tried to loosen the joints. These actions didn't look random. It was as if he was searching for weak points. During transport, the container was secured, but slight movement was unavoidable. At stops and turns, the structure shifted slightly. In those moments, Karu reacted more intensely. He pressed harder against the walls, as if trying to use the motion to his advantage. The accompanying staff observed his behavior. It was noted that he wasn't just reacting aggressively, he was systematically testing different parts of the structure. He shifted from one point to another, not staying long where there was no result. At one point, he focused on the door. Instead of trying to open it directly, he concentrated on the locking areas. He pulled, pushed, and tried to grip with his claws. The structure held, but his choice of target was telling. The journey took a long time. During that period, he changed his behavior several times. There were moments when he became still, followed by renewed activity. This pattern gave the impression that he wasn't acting constantly, but pausing, then trying a new approach. When the transport arrived in the city, the container was moved into the zoo's quarantine area. This was an isolated space intended for initial placement. The structures there were simpler than in the main enclosures, but still designed with safety in mind. When the container was opened, Karu didn't rush out. He stayed inside for a while, observing the space. Then he slowly stepped out and stopped. His movements were cautious. He sniffed, listened, and examined the surroundings. During the first hours, he barely interacted with objects. He moved along the perimeter, checking the boundaries. He approached the walls, touched them, then stepped away. It was a phase of initial assessment. However, within the first day, his behavior began to change. He started spending more time near specific elements. The stones in the enclosure caught his attention. He began moving them, at first over short distances. Then he started gathering them in one place. At the same time, he began working with the ground. Along the edges of the enclosure, the first signs of digging appeared. He dug in different spots, as if testing the depth and firmness of the base. He also interacted with objects inside. A metal feeding bowl was pushed out of place. He moved it, flipped it, and tried to use it in his actions. These early signs showed that even in a new environment, his behavior remained the same. He didn't just adapt, he immediately began exploring how he could influence the space. At that moment, the zoo staff did not yet see the situation as critical. However, early signs were already appearing that standard conditions might not be enough. From this point on, a new stage begins, one where Karu will no longer deal with temporary setups, but with a full enclosure designed specifically to contain him. After the quarantine period ended, Karu was moved to the main enclosure. The structure was considered secure and met all the requirements for housing honey badgers. The space was surrounded by strong walls, the base extended deep into the ground to prevent digging, and the upper section had protection to stop climbing. Inside, there were stones, logs, and areas with different soil densities. These were intentionally placed to mimic a natural environment and reduce stress. However, these same elements soon became part of his actions. In the first hours, Karu behaved calmly. He moved along the boundaries, examined the territory, and checked the surface of the walls. He didn't make sudden moves, but he spent longer at each section than expected. He paid special attention to the corners. He approached them, touched them with his paws, and then began digging. The first attempts were shallow, but their number quickly increased. He didn't focus on just one spot, he tested different areas, as if comparing them. When digging didn't bring results, he switched to other actions. The stones inside the enclosure began to change position. At first, he simply pushed them, then he started carrying them. He chose flatter, more stable ones and stacked them near the walls. These actions were repeated several times until small elevated structures formed. Then he tried to use them. He climbed onto these makeshift platforms, reached upward, and tested whether he could grip the upper part of the enclosure. The attempts didn't succeed, but he didn't stop. With each day, his actions became more varied. He didn't repeat the same method, he alternated between them. If digging didn't work, he switched to building. If that failed, he began working on the walls. In one instance, he started using his feeding bowl. He pushed it toward the wall, flipped it over, and tried to stand on it to gain extra height. The setup was unstable, but the fact that he used an object this way was noted. He also began testing the upper parts of the enclosure. He stood on his hind legs, stretched upward, touched the surface, and searched for a grip. These actions were repeated in different parts of the space. At the same time, digging continued. In some places, he went deeper than in others. He returned to areas he had already started and continued working. The soil around the enclosure gradually changed, becoming loose and uneven. Zoo staff began documenting these changes. It was clear that Karu was not just adapting to the new space, he was actively reshaping it. He moved objects, altered the soil structure, and tested the boundaries in every possible way. Despite this, the enclosure continued to do its job. None of his attempts resulted in an escape. This created the impression that the structure was holding. However, warning signs began to appear. In one corner, a digging attempt became deeper than expected. The foundation did extend into the ground, but in that area, the soil was softer. Karu returned there several times, deepening the spot. In another place, the stones were stacked higher than before. He kept adding more, making the structure more stable. Each new attempt looked like a continuation of the previous one. These changes didn't lead to immediate results, but they showed that his actions were becoming more focused. By this point, it was clear that the situation was evolving. He wasn't stopping, he was gradually improving his methods. Every action became part of a more complex process, and it was this process that would soon lead to the first truly serious escape attempts, ones that could no longer be ignored. The first weeks in the main enclosure gave the staff a sense of control. The structure held up. None of Karu's attempts led to a breakout, and all the changes inside the space seemed manageable. However, it was during this period that the behaviors began to form that would later lead to the first serious incidents. The changes were gradual and at first almost unnoticeable. Karu continued moving stones, but now he did it more selectively. He no longer chose just any stone, he picked ones with flatter shapes that stacked better. These stones he carried to specific sections of the wall. Over time, a stable structure began to form in one corner. It didn't look like a random pile. The stones were arranged in a way that created steps. The lower ones were larger and served as a base, while the upper ones were placed more carefully. Karu returned to this structure several times a day. He tested it, climbed up, climbed down, and rebuilt it again. If a stone shifted, he put it back or replaced it with another. At the same time, he continued working with the soil, but no longer in random spots. Instead, he focused on two specific areas. One was near the stone structure, and the other was on the opposite side of the enclosure. In the first area, he deepened a dig near the base of the wall. The soil there gradually became loose, and the depth increased. He worked in short sessions, returning to the same spot again and again. In the second area, his actions were different. He didn't try to go deep right away. Instead, he first widened the surface, as if preparing the ground. Only after that did he begin digging deeper. This distribution of effort looked like he was testing multiple strategies at once. The most noticeable changes occurred in the early morning hours, when activity in the zoo was minimal. Cameras showed that this was when Karu spent the most time working with objects. One day, he managed to use his stone structure more effectively than ever before. Climbing to the top level, he was able to reach the upper edge of the enclosure. He couldn't climb over, but his paws touched the top. That moment became a turning point. After that, he focused even more on the structure. He added new stones, adjusted their placement, and worked toward greater height and stability. Now his actions were clearly directed toward a specific goal. The staff didn't notice the change immediately. The structure was in a corner and didn't stand out at first. But during a routine check, it became clear that the height of the stone staircase had increased significantly. A decision was made to dismantle it. The stones were scattered around the enclosure, and additional elements were added to the corner to make access more difficult. For a short time, this worked. But within a few days, Karu started again. He began moving stones once more, but now he worked faster. He didn't spend time choosing randomly, he immediately selected suitable ones. His actions looked more confident, as if he already knew the result he wanted. At the same time, the digging intensified. In one area, the depth became critical. The base of the wall proved more complex than expected, but the surrounding soil had already been weakened. Then, one day, the cameras recorded a moment that changed everything. Karu was working at the dig site, then suddenly moved to the stone structure, climbed it, and once again tried to reach the upper edge. After that, he returned to digging. This showed that he wasn't just trying different methods, he was combining them. After this incident, the staff began to see his behavior as potentially serious. It became clear that if this continued, he might eventually succeed. Measures were prepared to reinforce the enclosure, but by the time they were ready to be implemented, Karu had already taken the next step. And that step would lead to his first real escape attempt, one that would come far closer to success than anyone expected. By the time the staff fully recognized the systematic nature of Karu's actions, the changes inside the enclosure had already gone beyond typical behavior. This no longer looked like simple activity within a confined space. Everything resembled a consistent process, where each attempt built on the previous one. One morning, during a routine inspection, it was noticed that the area at the base of the wall in the far corner had changed more than expected. The ground had sunk, and the edges of the dugout section had widened. This wasn't fresh digging. The work had been gradual, but the result had only now become visible. Camera footage helped reconstruct the events of the previous night. Karu started with digging. He worked longer than usual, deepening an existing hole. His movements were fast, but not random. He pushed the soil back, occasionally pausing to change the angle. Gradually, the depth increased. Then he stopped and moved to the stone structure. By that point, it had already been rebuilt after being dismantled, and it was even taller. The stones were placed more tightly, and the base looked stable. He climbed it without hesitation. Reaching the top, he stretched upward and gripped the edge of the enclosure. This time, he managed to hold on longer. He pulled himself up, but couldn't fully climb over. His hind legs couldn't find support. He dropped down and returned to digging. These actions repeated several times. He alternated between attempts. The hole grew deeper, then he tried from above again. Each movement looked like an adjustment of the previous one. At one point, the hole became deep enough to change his body position during the climb. When he went up the stones again and reached upward, the rear of his body was now lower than ground level. This created a better angle. That was when the first real escape risk appeared. He managed to grip more firmly and lift his body higher than before. For a few seconds, the front part of his body rose above the edge of the enclosure. It wasn't enough to get out, but the difference from previous attempts was clear. Then he dropped back down. He hadn't succeeded, but his actions showed that combining methods was starting to work. In the morning, the staff completely dismantled the stone structure. The stones were removed, part of the ground was leveled, and the hole was filled and compacted. A decision was also made to reinforce the upper section of the enclosure. Throughout the day, the enclosure was partially modified. Elements were added to make gripping more difficult, and the base was strengthened further. But the most important thing had already happened. Karu had gained experience that couldn't be removed along with the stones and soil. He understood that height and depth could work together. In the following days, his behavior changed. He spent less time on random actions. He moved more quickly to key areas. Where he had once tested different spots, he now focused on those where he had already achieved partial success. He began collecting stones again. Even after they were removed, he found new ones. He dug them out of the ground, carried them from other areas, and used any available objects. The process started again. Digging also resumed, this time in a different location, but following the same logic. The staff reinforced the enclosure again and again, but each change only altered the conditions of the challenge rather than stopping it. The tension was growing. It was no longer a question of whether an escape attempt would happen, but when it would succeed. And that moment was closer than anyone expected. By the time changes inside the enclosure began happening almost daily, the situation was no longer controlled in the usual sense. Any intervention had only a temporary effect. Karu didn't stop trying. He adapted his actions faster than the structure could be modified. A new stage began at night, when his activity was at its peak and human presence was minimal. Camera footage showed that he no longer spent time exploring the entire area. He moved directly to a chosen point. It was a section that had previously been used for digging, but had later been reinforced. Now he began working nearby. He dug quickly and deeply, throwing soil behind him without pause. The ground in that area was looser due to earlier work. This gave him an advantage. The hole expanded much faster than before. After some time, he stopped digging and moved to the stones. Despite regular removal, there were always objects left in the enclosure that could be used. He gathered them and carried them to the new spot. This time, the structure formed closer to the digging site than before. He placed the stones more tightly, testing their stability. If one shifted, he replaced it. His movements were confident and fast. He made almost no unnecessary actions. Then he began alternating stages, first digging, then working with stones, then attempting to climb. Each cycle took less time than in previous days. It looked like a refined sequence. At one point, the hole became deep enough to change the geometry of his movement. When he climbed the stones, the rear of his body dropped lower than before. He reached upward again. This time, his grip was stronger. His front paws rested on the edge of the enclosure, and he held the position longer. He pulled himself up, and the upper part of his body moved beyond the barrier. This was the first moment when escape became a real possibility. He tried to shift his weight forward. For a few seconds, his body balanced at the edge. But the support wasn't stable enough. The stones beneath him shifted slightly, and he lost balance. He fell back down. After the fall, he didn't stop. He almost immediately returned to digging. This was the key difference from earlier attempts. There was no pause, no hesitation. He continued working. During that same night, he repeated the attempt several times. Each time, he made small adjustments. He shifted stones, deepened the hole, changed the climbing point. It was as if he was fine-tuning a system. By morning, the enclosure looked more altered than ever before. The stones were gathered in one place, the ground heavily disturbed, and the chosen point was obvious. When the staff saw the area, they immediately understood the scale of what had happened. This time, action was taken without delay. All stones were removed. The hole was filled and compacted deeper than before. The base was reinforced with an additional layer. The upper part of the enclosure was modified with elements that made gripping impossible. Yet even with these changes, there was a clear understanding the problem was not gone. Karu had already shown that he could come close to success. He wasn't acting randomly. He was building a sequence and improving it. That realization became critical. Now it was no longer about preventing a single attempt, but about completely rethinking how to contain him. But before those changes could be fully implemented, one more episode would occur, and it would become the climax of this entire story. Decisions to reinforce the enclosure were made quickly, but their implementation took time. That gap became the most dangerous period. After the night when Karu first came close to escaping, his behavior did not weaken. On the contrary, it became even more focused. He no longer tested different areas. He chose one point and worked only there, as if all other options no longer existed. The next attempt began at a moment when everything seemed calm on the surface. During the day, he showed almost no activity. He moved slowly, occasionally stopping, but made no clear attempts. It created the impression that the intensity had dropped. But at night, everything changed. He went straight to the section that had been reinforced after the previous incident. First, he started digging. The soil was denser than before, but that didn't stop him. He changed the angle. Instead of digging straight down, he worked at a slope. It took more time, but allowed him to bypass the hardest layer. Gradually, the hole became deep enough to change his position during the climb. Then he began gathering objects. The stones had been removed, but other items remained in the enclosure. He used everything available. He dragged the heavy feeding bowl, flipped it over, and pushed it closer to the wall. He pulled pieces of wood and placed them at the base. The structure was less stable than before, but he continued reinforcing it. Then he began climbing. He stepped onto the lower level, then moved higher using the structure he had built. He stretched upward and touched the top of the enclosure. This time, the modifications made it harder to grip, but not impossible. He found a point. He pulled himself up. The front part of his body rose above the edge again. He held himself there for a few seconds, then began shifting his weight forward. His hind legs searched for support. The structure beneath him started to move, but didn't collapse immediately. This was the critical moment. He managed to get farther than ever before. For a brief instant, his body was almost entirely above the barrier. It was the limit he had been working toward all this time, but he couldn't hold it. One of the elements beneath him shifted more than the others. His balance broke and he fell back inside again. The fall was hard, but didn't cause serious harm. He got up almost immediately. This time, however, he didn't return to the attempt right away. He stopped. He walked around the area, then moved away and lay down. His behavior changed. His activity dropped. This pause was unexpected. In the morning, the staff saw the aftermath. The area was more disrupted than ever before. The makeshift structure was partly intact. The hole had deepened, and the marks on the enclosure showed how close he had come to success. After that, a final decision was made. The enclosure was completely redesigned. The base was extended much deeper than before. All movable objects were removed or replaced with fixed elements. The upper section was modified to eliminate any possible grip points. After these changes, attempts continued, but their nature changed. He still dug, moved objects, and tested boundaries, but the same sequence that had once brought him close to escape no longer formed. Karu's story became a defining case. It confirmed what was already known about honey badgers as one of the most persistent and intelligent species. Observations showed that under certain conditions, their behavior goes beyond simple reactions and takes on the qualities of structured problem-solving. The main conclusion reached by the staff was clear. Standard measures do not always account for the behavioral complexity of such animals. Simply strengthening structures does not solve the problem if the behavior itself continues to evolve. Karu was not the only case like this, but his story showed just how far an animal can go when its environment becomes a challenge rather than a limit. This is not the end of his story, but this episode became the turning point after which the approach to keeping honey badgers in captivity began to change.